Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about, hello Sherry, nice to see you today. I'm glad I helped make your day the other day. So today I'm going to talk about the self, and part of the reason for doing this is that BTS, the group from India, or I'm sorry, the group from South Korea, is now #1 in the world, and they're #1 in the world based on this book, an album based on this book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction. And so today I'm going to read a portion of Dr. Stein's introduction to the Map of the Soul. But first, I want to orient you a little, because what we have to understand is that when we're born, it's like being born with a fully operational, high-powered computer system, and we don't know anything about it. All we know is that it's there. And so the first part of our lives is about sorting it out. Okay, sort yourself out, as Dr. Jordan Peterson says, means trying to understand what it is that is happening to us in the first part of our life. And of course, we have parents and teachers to help us with that, but they don't very often talk about how our psyche works. And so what I'm trying to do for, there's so many young people who are attracted to BTS and now to a book about Dr. Jung, I'm trying to give a basic understanding of what that's about. And so the first thing to understand, and Dr. Stein mentions this at the end of this passage that I'm going to read, is that in 1928, Dr. Jung had a dream which was symbolic of finding the self, finding the deepest archetype within oneself. And the essence of that dream was that he was in Liverpool in the United Kingdom, and it was a dark and rainy night. He was with some other Swiss, and the city in his dream was laid out like a mandala. It was laid out in a circle around a center. And when he came down to the center with his friends, he saw an island out in the middle of a small pond. And on that island was a magnolia tree. So that's why up in the corner here, you're seeing a magnolia at the moment. He saw a magnolia tree, and on that magnolia tree was a beautiful, flowering of the magnolia, and the sun was shining only on that magnolia tree. And that symbolically represented for him the self, and it was a very important dream. And the people of Liverpool were so taken by it that they erected a statue to Dr. Jung, and it says on the statue, "Liverpool, the pool of life," and that's symbolically what he was talking about. And so we need to understand what the greater personality is, and the God image, the so-called God image. And so I want to read to you, before I get into Dr. Stein's book, I want to read to you a little passage from this book, Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology, by Dr. Lawrence W. Jaffe. Now, Dr. Jaffe was, I'm given to believe that he was the son of Agnella Jaffe, who was the editor of Dr. Jung's history, his Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was in effect the autobiography of the development of his own psyche. And it's quite a lovely book, but Dr. Lawrence Jaffe, and unfortunately I discovered this after his death, but he died in 2003, but he left us this gem of a book. And so I'm going to read just a very short passage from it. It's on page 24 of this book, Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology. Jesus' words, "The kingdom of God is within you," are being realized in our day. Many people must find a relationship to the religious attitude through their own individual experience. They cannot accept dogmatic assertions. As Jung writes, quote, "Man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of the propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, or the child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God." And that quote is from C.G. Jung Letters, Volume 2, page 316. Depth psychology, supporting the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, can help us to understand and interpret our own experience and live our own hypothesis. To the extent that we can achieve this, we make a contribution, however small, toward helping God incarnate in this world. Experience now supplants faith. Only individual experience is of sufficient weight to counterbalance the dictates of scientism and materialism. These twin furies continually whisper that the individual is of negligible significance, except as part of a group. The idea that there is anything of worth within an individual is dismissed. Subjective experience, adjudged now of little value, is equivalent to the stone that the builders rejected, which is destined nevertheless to become the cornerstone of the new church. A church of the individual's experience of God incarnating within. This is the momentous task of the coming age, that value and dignity should be restored to the human individual. Okay, so that's Dr. Jaffe's comment from Liberating the Heart. And so now what I'm going to do, this magnolia, as I indicated, is symbolic of the deepest archetype in the unconscious, the self. And you can see the lighter yellow sun in the center of that really represents the whole thing. And so now what I want to do is give you a more logos-oriented version of it. Let me just, okay, here it is. Okay, so this is a more logos-oriented version, and I'll make it a little bigger on your screen so that you can see it more easily. And I'll, there. Okay, so this is a logos-oriented version to help you picture in your mind from a logical point of view where this is. Now this image, this figure 5, comes from Dr. Edward Edinger's book, The Ion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Ion, by Dr. Edward Edinger, edited by Deborah Wesley. And this is based on lectures that Dr. Edinger gave in the 1980s, I believe. And so these lectures are explaining this book, Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung, which is volume 9, small Roman numeral 2 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And so all of this is what Dr. Stein is referring to in his part of the book. But let me go back and just look at your comments here. Carlos says, how did your conception of time change as you got older? Well, it's going by much more quickly, I'll say that. Hart says, I skip, but you're not moving. We're all moving along through the time-space continuum. We all fell out of the pleroma, and we're going back there, so stand by. And so Sherry says BRB. I don't know what that stands for, guys. My girls are home today and they're way too rowdy. Okay, so Sherry isn't going to be with us perhaps. But anyway, I'm going to read this passage. And so now I'm going back to Mary Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an Introduction, which is available in Korean and many other languages. And thanks to BTS and the BTS Army, it's now a bestseller, which I'm sure pleases Dr. Stein very much. But I'm going to leave Dr. Edinger's diagram on the screen because it will help orient you a little bit in terms of what Dr. Stein is saying. So now I'll read. The psyche's transcendent center and wholeness, the self. I was tempted to begin this book with a chapter on the self because it is the most fundamental feature of Jung's entire vision. It is the key to his psychological theory, and in some respects it is the piece that most sets him apart from all other figures in depth psychology and psychoanalysis. It is instructive to note that psychoanalytic theory has moved significantly in Jung's direction over the past half-century, and yet few, if any, other psychoanalytic theorists have ventured as far as his conception of the self in their theorizing. While many other writers today use the term self in their clinical studies and theoretical statements, none has in mind the same domain that Jung was trying to encompass with his concept. To begin with Jung's theory of the self would have been misleading, however, historically and conceptually. It is not only the most fundamental feature of his theory, it is also the capstone. It therefore needs preparation in order to grasp its full range and importance. For Jung, the self is transcendent, which means that it is not defined by or contained within the psychic realm, but rather lies beyond it and, in an important sense, defines it. It is this point about the self's transcendence that makes Jung's theory different from those of other self-theorists like Kohut. For Jung, the self is paradoxically not oneself. It is more than one subjectivity, in other words, what's coming from your mind. It is more than one subjectivity, and its essence lies beyond the subjective realm. The self forms the ground for the subject's commonality with the world, with the structures of being. In the self, subject and object, ego and other are joined in a common field of structure and energy. This is the point I hope will become most salient from what follows in this chapter. The typical English usage of the word self makes it difficult to appreciate what Jung is getting at in his theory. As used in everyday parlance and everyday speech, self is equivalent to ego. When we say that someone is selfish, we mean that they are egotistical or narcissistic. But in a Jungian vocabulary, self is the opposite meaning. To say that someone is self-centered is to say that they are precisely not egotistical and narcissistic, but rather philosophical, having a wide perspective and not personally reactive or easily thrown off balance. When the ego is well connected to the self, a person stands in relationship with a transcendent center and is precisely not narcissistically invested in nearsighted goals and short-term gains. In such persons, there is an ego-free quality, as though they were consulting a deeper and wider reality than merely the practical, rational, and personal considerations typical of ego consciousness. Subtitle: Jung's Experience of the Self. Before entering into a discussion of Ion, the central text of Jung's self-theory, I think it will be useful to the reader to have an impression of Jung's original experiences that led him to postulate the existence of the self. His later theorizing sprang from his experience. Jung's own account of his major experience of the self places it in the period between 1916 and 1918. During this difficult time in his life, he made the major discovery that at bottom, the psyche rests on a fundamental structure, and that this structure is able to withstand the shocks of abandonment and betrayal, which threaten to undo a person's mental stability and emotional balance. This was the discovery of a deep, largely unconscious pattern of psychological unity and wholeness. And obviously, when you're a young person trying to sort yourself out, it would be very nice if you could establish psychological unity and wholeness. For Jung, the experience of the self, that most impersonal of all archetypes, had a highly dramatic quality. It came out of his inner struggles and turmoil and capped a period of his life that often had him wondering if he was losing his way in a psychic wilderness. There were no maps for him to consult as he groped through a jungle of tangled emotions, ideas, memories, and images. In his autobiography, he calls this the period of the confrontation with the unconscious. At the time of his momentous discovery, Jung was already well launched into his midlife crisis. About 41 years old, he had broken with Freud some 5 years earlier and had after that suffered emotional disorientation and professional uncertainty, from which he was now gradually recovering. He refers to the first half of his midlife crisis, 1913 to 1916, as the time when he discovered the inner world, the anima, the plurality of unconscious images and fantasies. Throughout these years of inner exploration, Jung recorded his dreams, fantasies, and other important experiences in an elaborately detailed and illustrated document, which has come to be called the Red Book. While struggling to sort out the images and emotions that had burst upon him from the unconscious, he had also been trying to understand how they fit together and what they meant. He had used practices such as yoga breathing to maintain his emotional equilibrium. When his emotions threatened to destroy his psychic equilibrium and sanity, he used meditation, play therapy, active imagination, and drawing to calm down. A therapist to himself, he worked out techniques which he later would use with patients to keep his own ego consciousness stable in the midst of this flood of material from the unconscious. Now, as he continued to observe, listen, and record his inner experiences, his openness increased to the archetypal end of the psychic continuum and to the spirit world into which it merges. After spending several years at the anima level, he began to enter into a territory that revealed the archetype of the self, the most fundamental archetype of psychic wholeness and order. This discovery of the self is recounted in his autobiography and took place in the period of several years. Now, before I go on, is everyone hearing me, even if my image has somehow stopped developing, because I'm seeing that the stream health is bad for some reason again, and I am about to upgrade my computer equipment. I don't know if that's the cause of it, but I am going to do that over the next week. But for purposes of today, I'm going to keep going with this reading, and hopefully I'll be able to work out these stream health issues to better service in the future. But anyway, I shall go on. If you're hearing me, please, if you're hearing me at least, I see there's 12 of you online right now live. I'd very much appreciate it if you would put in the chat that you can hear. And hopefully you can also see, even if the image is still. What happened yesterday is all the audio got into the video that's on YouTube, but it shows only still images of me, which is okay because most people listen to this material. Most people listen to this material on their iPhone or their smartphone. And Art says, "Hi, Skip, but you're not moving." Yes, that's what this poor stream health would suggest. I'm not sure whether if I just stopped, if that would solve it. But anyway, I'm going to continue the discussion, and I presume that you can see Dr. Edinger's diagram here, so that's probably more important than to see my smiling face. So anyway, I'm going to go on with this reading. I'm going to read about 3 more pages. Okay, so we're talking about this period of several years during Dr. Jung's midlife crisis. First, there was the peculiar incident of the ringing doorbell. Jung tells of how one Sunday afternoon in 1916, as he was sitting in his living room on Seestrasse in Kusnacht, he sensed a heavy emotional atmosphere in the house. The members of his household seemed tense and irritable. He did not understand why, but the air seemed charged with the presence of unseen figures. Suddenly the doorbell rang. He went to answer it, but no one was there. Yet the knocker was clearly moving. He swears he saw it move by itself. When the maid asked what had rung the bell, Jung said he did not know, since there was no one at the door. It rang again. This time the maid also saw the knocker move. He was not hallucinating. And then Jung heard the following words suggest themselves. Quote, "The dead came back from Jerusalem, where they found not what they sought. They prayed me, let them in, and besought my word, and thus I began my teaching." Unquote. He decided to write these words down. More came. Hearken, I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as fullness. In infinity, full is no better than empty. Nothingness is both empty and full. As well might you say anything else of nothingness, as, for instance, white is it, or black, or again, it is not, or it is. This nothingness or fullness we name the pleroma. Unquote. Over the next few days, Jung took down, as by dictation, a Gnostic text entitled 7 Sermons of the Dead. This teaching, delivered in the words and under the identity of the ancient Gnostic master Basilides, is a message that came to Jung from the archetypal realm of the psyche. Now, I want to stop here just for a moment and point out to you that on the homepage of this video channel, this YouTube channel, you will find my reading of the entire 7 Sermons of the Dead in a playlist of their own. And so you can find that if you look down on the homepage, you will find the entire 7 Sermons of the Dead. I also want to point out that very often over the last century, people have dismissed Jung because they say, oh, he's just a Gnostic. Well, that's baloney, okay, because that is the way the church, and later even the Protestant church, has kept down the direct experience with God. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. The Gnostics were about a direct experience with God, and the church and all theologians of every religion want to interpose themselves between God and the individual. And so, partially that made sense because, as Dr. Jung said, the great religions are all methods of psychotherapy that evolved naturally from early Iron Age men over a period of 2,000 years. And so they didn't have psychology at that time. They didn't even have the scientific method. So these things came to them. They explained them in the best way they can. And the reason it's called the God image as well as the self is that they thought they were communicating with a being that's out there in the universe, and really it's here. And the Gnostics were into that, they knew that, but the church wanted to intermediate between that self, that God image, and the ordinary person, because most people couldn't really follow what it was all about. And so the church got into selling magic, okay? And so a lot of myths in all the church, in all religions, are basically magical ideas, which unfortunately, when the scientific method came along in around 1500 and the so-called Enlightenment, the Enlightenment meant, oh, now we have logic and we can work out what all these things really mean. And the problem is that logic doesn't get at it at all, because everything, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche, not a statement of the physical world. And so the churches could explain these mysteries, but they didn't compute with logic. And so this is where there became a split in what people were thinking about. And it's where we have a fundamental issue with Jordan Peterson, because he thinks everything is about logos and hierarchy. But the reality is that there's an entire side of the psyche, which is life itself. And Jordan Peterson, let's put it this way, all education is about logos, and you're using words to teach children from the very youngest to the PhD level different aspects of living in the physical world. That's what a professor does. That's what a kindergarten teacher does. But they're not teaching about actual living. They're teaching about kind of the rules of living. And in order for them to be meaningful, you have to have life. And so, as Leonardo da Vinci said, And he felt put upon throughout his life, according to Walter Isaacson in his biography, Leonardo da Vinci. But here's what Isaacson said. Leonardo described himself as a man without letters and a disciple of experience, with its swipe against those who would cite ancient wisdom rather than make observations on their own. Though I have no power to quote from authors as they have, I shall rely on a far more worthy thing, my experience. That's a Leonardo quote. And then he says, he who has access to the fountain does not go to the water jar. And so in the context of Leonardo's quote, the water jar is all the books in your house, the ones you see behind me here, and this book and every other book you ever read, those amount to the water jar. Those are the logos. But life is the fountain. It's not the water jar, and that's the significant point. Gray Yates says, logic has become magic. We need logic and the illogical. Yes, and we certainly need logic. I'm not speaking against logic, because every physical thing that we have in life has come from the logos. So if I show you an iPhone, for example, this iPhone has to be put together 100% perfectly every time, millions and millions of times. In fact, I think there's more than 1 billion iPhones out there, and they wouldn't be popular if they were different. They have to be perfectly made, 100%. The automobile that you drive has to be perfectly made, 100%. And that's all logos. And men over millennia have tended toward that logos logic side of our psyche. But that's not life. This is not life. And staring at it is not life. What's life is the communication. Life is you listening to me now and it having some meaning to you or not. But it's an experience. It's not a thing. And could I define what is passing between you and me right now? Obviously not. Okay, you can't make it 100% perfect. What's passing between me and every person that's listening to this, whether live or on playback, is life. Okay, and I couldn't describe it, nor could you, exactly what its significance is between the two of us, and that's the eros side of living, and that's what we've kind of forgotten and we've gotten away from, and that's the flaw in the way Dr. Jordan Peterson has presented himself. He's attractive to men because men tend to want to have all the rules. And, oh, by the way, I can live my life. If I have all the rules, I can be perfect with it. But the problem is you can't live your life that way. You have to live your life in some other way in order to have a fulfilling life. Otherwise, you're just a robot. And Carlos says, why are Jungian ideas horror-themed? I feel as though it scares people. For example, the Red Book or your book, Tsunami of Blood, it's kind of creepy and dark. Well, the Red Book is not horror-themed. It's themed on actual unconscious and the way the unconscious presents itself, and the way complexes present itself. And by Dr. Jung's method of active imagination, he learned and then taught the rest of us that have followed him that if you allow your unconscious to come through, you can actually, in imagery, see what your unconscious is trying to tell you, and it's in the form of a being, a human being, or in some cases a snake. That's not horror. That's just a description of the way the unconscious works. My name for my book, Tsunami of Blood, was had the intention of being an attention getter, because I perceived in 2007 exactly what would happen in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and the failure of the normal religions, the great religions around the world, to understand that they need to focus on what the others taught, because instead of flying apart, if they keep flying apart, they're going to be washed out by the fact that human beings are still at some level barbaric. And so human beings still have the idea that my religion is right and yours is wrong. And that's not true at all, because they're all right and they all contain psychic facts. And they evolved differently, so they're somewhat different. But if we look at them in the fullness of time, as Dr. Jung did, we realize that they all contain basically the same elements. And they have all served a purpose of psychological balancing through life for early human beings. But now we have to have a different approach, which is the approach I read at the beginning, and maybe I'll read at the end. And yes, it is kind of creepy and enjoyable. I think in point of fact, creepy things sometimes are instructive. For example, horror films. Okay, horror films are meant to scare you, and what they do is that they present some things that come up in the human psyche. And so it's a little bit like you walk out of the theater into the sunlight and you look around and you see, wow, there's no vampires, there's no monsters, there's no devil out here. And it's a bit like your mommy telling you when you're growing up there's no such thing as the boogeyman. Well, actually there is. and I learned that. Why do children love toys of dinosaurs? And the reason is, in my opinion, and I have a direct experience with this, the reason is that we all have visions, images in our deep psyche of dinosaurs. We actually have those images in our psyche. The reason is that dinosaurs were around for so long, even long before there were primates, but long before there were primates, that those images were there in this world, and those images have been carried down to us, and unconsciously through the DNA. In fact, we don't know what the mechanism is, but I do know that when I was 6 years old, I saw a movie, and I had never seen a dinosaur. I had never seen a book about a dinosaur up until that time. And I'm talking about the year 1952 now. And I went to a black and white movie with my parents, and it was an early version of Jurassic Park. And in that movie, there was a pretend Tyrannosaurus Rex. Okay, but within a day or two, I had a dream about a dinosaur. And that dinosaur had it was one of these dinosaurs with a very long neck, 40 feet tall, that eats out of the top of trees. And now if you go to the Museum of Natural History, you can see artist conceptions of those actual creatures. But I had never experienced it. I had never seen a picture of it, nothing. but it came out of my deep unconscious. So I know that image was there in my deep unconscious because I had never seen an image of a dinosaur. But when I saw that movie at age 6, it constellated dinosaurs, and it got my unconscious starting to present images of dinosaurs, which were quite threatening. But now we see that dinosaur toys are quite popular because a kid can have an image of a dinosaur in a dream or something, but it doesn't terrify them because they can put it physically in front of them in the form of a toy, and that means it's not threatening. And so to me, that's what that means. And so, there are a lot of creepy things in the world, but we have to decide which things come with the equipment and which things are actually in the physical world. And and one other thing I wanted to mention about this 7 Sermons of the Dead, the very first part of it, where it says that the dead came back from Jerusalem, where they found not what they sought. Okay, and that's highly relevant to what happened at Notre Dame the other day, because the dead in this case were crusaders, or humans from Europe who had gone to Jerusalem to connect with God, and they thought that they would find God there. And the point is that God is not in those buildings in Jerusalem, neither then nor now. And so when you go to Jerusalem, you might have a religious experience that's all about you, but it's not that normal. It's just, oh, gee, this is where they say that Christ was crucified. Well, okay, yes, this is where they say that. Do we have any proof of that? I don't know, because the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, was built in the year 400 AD, so it was, or something like that, by Greek missionaries and priests. So, did they pick the right place? I don't know, maybe, but the point is that Christ is not there. Okay, Christ is not in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's the point of the Easter story, that Christ is not there. Christ is in spiritual form, and Christ lives in the hearts of every Christian, and is known and accepted, for example, by all Muslims, because Christ is a prophet in Islam, and the Christ story actually appears in the Quran, as does the story of Moses, or Moses himself, not the story, but Moses himself does appear in the Quran, and in Surah number 18. And so the intuition that Dr. Jung was having by this vision was that this eros side of reality was not present in Jerusalem. We have not found what we sought. And so what did you seek? You old dead crusaders, well, they sought a connection to God. And so anyway, let me read on. So the point being, in part, the Gnostics were about a direct experience of God, and the church was against that because the church wanted to create a profession of priests or ministers or mullahs or whatever have you. And so they created religions that intermediated between the ego and the self, basically. And so over the next few years, Jung took down, as if by dictation, a Gnostic text entitled Seven Sermons of the Dead. This teaching, delivered in the words and under the identity of the ancient Gnostic master Basilides, is a message that came to Jung from the archetypal realm of the psyche. Of course, one knows that Jung was very interested in Gnosticism prior to this visitation, and that he had read many fragments of ancient Gnostic texts, so there were undoubtedly many connections to this visionary experience in his living room and library. Yet this was also a highly imaginative and creative new work, albeit in the form of a grandiose religious text, and it came spontaneously from the depths of Jung's own psyche. He was not simply quoting from memory. Even cryptomnesia does not account for it, since it cannot be found elsewhere in the classic texts of Gnosis. And cryptomnesia is a fact in psychotherapy where you experience something maybe when you're a little kid, but you forget it, and then it comes out later and you don't make the connection back to the original thing, which I could admit that my discussion of the dinosaur earlier, there might be cryptomnesia present, in the sense that maybe I did see a picture in a book or a magazine at one time before age 6. I don't think I did, because that wasn't very common at that point of time, 1952. But it's possible that that happened, and if that happened, then that's a cryptomnesia in my psyche, and that's how I'm talking with you about it now. But obviously it was quite a numinous experience for me, because I still remember it 66 years later. And so anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I have to admit that it is possible that there was cryptomnesia there, but I don't think so. Nor was he trying deliberately to write in the style of the Gnostics. This writing was not intentional. In retrospect, it can be seen that this text, which was completed in about 3 days, contains the seeds of many ideas that Jung would work out in the following decades in more rational, intellectual, and scientific terms. This was one of many unusual psychic experiences during these years of confrontation with unconscious. At a more mundane level, Jung carried on with his life and his professional practice. This period coincided almost exactly with World War I, during which Switzerland, a neutral country, was isolated from Europe and the wider world. Travel was impossible. Like all Swiss adult men, Jung was in the army. He was a medical officer, and he was assigned the role of commandant at the prisoner of war camp at Chateau d'Eu in the French-speaking part of the country. It must have been a more or less tedious administrative job, and he began routinely to spend some time each morning drawing circles and elaborating them as he felt inclined to do so. After this experience, he would feel refreshed and ready for the day ahead. This activity centered him, he says in his autobiography. Some of these drawings turned into very elaborate paintings. Jung later compared them to what Tibetan Buddhists call mandalas, images that represent the cosmos, the spiritual universe of the Buddhist practitioner. And of course, mandalas, Dr. Jung later studied mandalas and found them appearing in every society going back 35,000 years to the first examples that he could find, which were in Zimbabwe about 35,000 years ago. Some 20 years later, on his trip to India, Jung would note with great interest how people paint these traditional images on the walls of their homes or in temples in order to stay connected to cosmic spiritual powers or to fend off evil forces and influences. Mandalas have both a protective and a prayerful function. Jung came to realize that he was reproducing a universal underlying archetypal pattern that has to do with putting things in order. And you can think of a kaleidoscope where every time you turn it around, the order changes and you get a different image, but it's still a psychic whole, and it's therefore a mandala. This experience led him eventually to the conclusion that if a spontaneously unfolding psychic process is followed to its own logical end and is permitted to express itself fully, the goal of this process will be fulfilled, namely to manifest universal images of order and unity. The mandala is a universal symbol that expresses the intuition of ordered wholeness. To name the archetypal factor that is operative in the psyche producing this goal and this pattern, Jung chose the term self, following the Indian Upanishads in their designation of the higher personality, the Atman. This experience of drawing and elaborating mandalas would stay with Jung as the central experience of the self, emerging slowly, experientially, spontaneously into consciousness. Finally, Jung recorded a dream in 1928 that represented for him the completion of his realization of the self. Although the intensity of his midlife crisis was over by 1920, the lingering aftermath continued until 1928, when Jung was 52 years old. Throughout his 40s, Jung lived in a kind of psychological liminality or limbo, at first intensely and deeply, and then less so. At the end, he had a dream in which he found himself in the English city of Liverpool. He was walking through the streets with a group of Swiss friends on a rainy night, and soon they came upon an intersection that was shaped like a wheel. Several streets radiated from this hub, and in the middle of the intersection there was a square. While everything was dark in the surrounding area, this center island was brightly lit. On it there grew a single tree, a magnolia, full of reddish blossoms. His companions did not seem able to see the beautiful tree, but Jung was overcome with the beauty of it. Later he interpreted this dream to mean that he had been given a vision of the center, the self, an image of unearthly beauty that is located in the pool of life, Liverpool. From this dream experience, he writes, emerged a first inkling of my personal myth. In this key passage, Jung declares the self to be the center of his personal myth. He later conceived of it as the prime archetype, the one, from which all the other archetypes and archetypal images ultimately derive. The self is the magnetic center of Jung's psychological universe. Its presence pulls the ego's compass needle to true north. Now, as I continue to talk about this, I'm going to give you back the magnolia blossom. Okay, so this is symbolic of the self, and the significant thing about when Dr. Stein says pulls the ego to to true north, what he means by that is that, when we're sorting ourselves out, we really don't know what is going to make us happy later in life. And so we have to go out and try things. We have to make mistakes. We have to try whatever seems right at the time, wherever we are in the world, whoever we are. we have to go from our central place. Okay, think of each of us as the center of a universe, our universe. And we don't know the right path, but what happens is the slings and arrows of life cause us to fail sometimes. We fail. We try something that we shouldn't have been trying because it wasn't for us. And we could think of that, it can happen at any point of life, even in my Marine Corps career. Even though I succeeded to the rank of lieutenant colonel, I was lieutenant colonel, and suddenly, boom, I fell down and broke my leg in uniform. And so in Jung's context, that accident represents myself telling me, or we can call it an act of God, that that accident caused me to reevaluate my life and to reorient my life in a different way, which I did. And ultimately, that led to founding a company that became a public company. And then I retired from that company, and I thought I had enough money for life. And 3 years later, boom, the crash of 2008 came along, and I lost my life savings. And I'm still struggling with that today, 11 years later. But because that happened, I'm doing this video right now, and you're here with me today. And all of those things, that wouldn't have happened had not an act of God, or however you want to put it, but something changed my life. And so we have to remember Dr. Jung's definition of God. So he was asked to define God one time, and here's what he said. God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. So you can see that that definition definitely fits my experience of breaking my leg in the Marine Corps, because my willful path was to continue on as a Marine Corps officer until I was a general officer. But, something crossed my path, crossed my willful path. My willful path was to be a general, but something crossed my path violently and recklessly, okay? And it upset my subjective views on what I could do, and my plans and intentions. So you can see that sort of thing happening in your own life very often. And if you think of God in that way, then you know that you have to go and rely on your inner strength, yourself. And that is your center. And so at that point, I had to reorient my life, whether you follow it in that way or not. That's what Dr. Jung was talking about, I believe. Now let me look at your comments here. Going back to the creepiness of dinosaurs and Tsunami of Blood and those things in horror movies. And Grace said they're also kind of creepily enjoyable. And Carlos said, indeed. Grace says, that's the point. It seems we need both. And Carlos says, plus dinosaurs are badass. And Sherry says, guys, we'll catch up later and definitely be here tomorrow. Motherhood is calling my name several times over, in fact. So have a great day. And so the point is we need both. The point is that something irrational happens. So when a week ago today Notre Dame burned, what did we lose and what was it? And what I know is that when I saw the news opening on my television set last Monday night, I broke into spontaneous sobbing. And, there's no good logical reason for why I was sobbing. Okay, the Notre Dame is a Catholic church, and Catholics forced my ancestors out of Europe about 400 years ago, nearly 400 years ago. And so why should I have a love for Catholicism per se? That's, a fair question considering my ancestry and so on. But there's something irrational about it and I can't put my finger on it exactly. But when I was talking about it again in the evening that night, while I was doing last evening's regular reading group session, which happens on Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I again broke into spontaneous sobbing. And so what I know is that there is life in that the loss of Notre Dame is just a physical thing in the physical world, but it represents something, it's symbolic of something that's on the irrational side of life, something that I cannot explain, but which is extremely powerful. And so yesterday, when we learned the news that, well, actually, I only learned this morning that 300 people were killed in Sri Lanka, but yesterday I knew that it was over 100. And, terrorists can snuff out those physical lives, but the spirit of those people spread to the world. And that cannot be killed. Okay, it's like, my wife works at the hospice, and so I have thoughts daily about what it's like to be dying under the care of hospice. And, what I would say to my family members when I see them for the last time. And basically the idea is, well, help me through this transition, but when I've finally died, I'll be leaving with you, because my spirit will be with you, and it will be wherever you go for the rest of your life. And I already know that that's true from the deaths of my grandparents and my parents and my brother, because all of them live in my heart in very much the same way that they always did. They are immortal in that way. And so the fact that the physical body stopped operating is, it's a physical fact, but it's not a spiritual fact. And I think that's an important way to think about these things, that there is an irrational side of life, and it's very significant, and it's somewhat different in each one of us. And it's also quite the same in every human being in other ways. And so we have to recognize that that's true. And so when Dr. Jung and Dr. Jaffe talk about incarnating God in us, it doesn't mean that we're gods. It means that we have a divine element within us. You could think of it as God, but, there's 7.5 billion of us, And so we can't all be gods, and it's an inflation. It's going too far if we think that we are the gods and we're the ones. We do have such a person in the presidency of the United States. Only I can fix it, he says. Okay, well, that's an extreme inflation that's way out of whack, and so we can't have 7.5 billion of us running around like that, grabbing all the material things of life. That's not appropriate at all. And so we have to, maintain contact with ourself and understand where we fit, where our little tile is going to fit in the great mosaic of life going forward, because it does fit. Whether we have children or not, that's irrelevant, because if we do anything in life, then our spirit is going to pass forward to others, and it may not be remembered, but each one of us, we put ripples in the pond all the time, and those radiate out, and people may not remember our physical body by name, but our spirit keeps going out into the world. Tinfoil Hat says it's comparable to the parable of the prodigal son. I'm sort of at a loss. I mean, obviously I know the parable of the prodigal son, but I haven't been studying it for years, so I can't really do that metaphor very well myself. You're welcome to try to put it on the chat if you are able to. But now I want to come back again to liberating the heart. And keep in mind that when we say God image, which is in the title of this video, Dr. Jung was talking about the deepest archetype in the unconscious, which he called the self, but he also called the God image. And his point was that human beings cannot tell the difference between the physical God and the metaphysical God, the God of theology. But the irony is that all psychology is metaphysical, because it's, there isn't a scientist that can look in your brain and see what you're thinking, or know what your visions are, or know what images are in your brain. We haven't come anywhere near that as yet. And so, yes, they can do a MRI on your brain and they can see what's lighting up when you're having a dream or something like that. I'm not sure it's that healthy to let scientists experiment on you in that way. But okay, they can tell something electrical is happening in the brain, but they can't tell you anything about what's the actual content and what's actually happening in your brain. And so that's what religions have tried to develop the psyche over thousands of years, and we've tried to mold mankind itself in certain ways, and mankind does get molded. And so modern human beings are more or less the same. I used to, before I was 32 years old, I'd never been to Europe, and I used to think, boy, I really would love to go to Europe and get the flavor of how different things are and so on. And then when I finally went to Europe, I was in a business meeting. It was in a hotel, and it was pretty much like any business meeting in any hotel anywhere in the world. And I started to realize that really we're all living our lives more or less the same. I mean, even the images of North Vietnam, which was my sworn enemy when I was a Marine officer in Vietnam. But when I looked at the images of Hanoi, when our president went there recently, Hanoi is pretty much like any other Asian city I ever visited. And I've spent a good portion of my life in Asia. I speak Japanese and Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. And I've been to Singapore maybe 50 times at least. And I have a business partner in Kuala Lumpur to this day. And so we really are the same in the way we live around the world. And even Africa, which has been underdeveloped, is developing and becoming more and more like the rest of us. And there are very few primitive peoples left anywhere in the world. There are few in maybe Papua New Guinea, and there's a few tribes in Africa, but not terribly many. Most of us are pretty much the same. And when we're presented with modern life, we just go into it. All right, so I just want to remind you at the end of this live stream what Drs. Jung and Jaffe were talking about. And I'm again reading from this book, Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology, published by Inner City Books. Jesus' words, "The kingdom of God is within you," are being realized in our day. Many people must find a relationship to the religious attitude through their, Many people must find a relationship to the religious attitude through their own individual experience. They cannot accept dogmatic assertions. As Jung writes, quote, "Man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of propitiating praise to an unpredictable king or the child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God." And when he's talking about propitiating praise, that includes things like sacrifice, human sacrifice. Human beings were sacrificing their children until very recently. In fact, we still do. We just call it other names like warfare. But, the early Jews were sacrificing their children. And it was when Abraham had a vision that he could sacrifice a goat instead of his son Isaac, that was kind of the beginning of all Abrahamic religions. And so that's the unpredictable king that they're propitiating, or the child's prayer to a loving father. Of course, we all, when we were raised and taught, the basics of Christianity or whatever our religion was, we learned to pray to the loving father, whether we call that God or Allah or Krishna or what have you, or the Buddha. And so depth psychology, supporting the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, can help us to understand and interpret our own experience and live our own hypothesis. To the extent that we can achieve this, we make a contribution, however small, toward helping God incarnate in the world. Experience now supplants faith. Only individual experience is of sufficient weight to counterbalance the dictates of scientism and materialism. These twin furies continually whisper that the individual is negligible. The individual is of negligible significance, except as part of a group. The idea that there is anything the idea that there is anything of worth within an individual is dismissed. Subjective experience, a judge now of little value, is equivalent to the stone that the builders rejected, which is destined nevertheless to become the cornerstone of a new church. a church of the individual's experience of God incarnating within them. This is the momentous task of the coming age, that value and dignity should be restored to the human individual. And based on that, I just want to again remind you of Dr. Jung's paragraph from Man and His Symbols, found on page 101 of this book. And this essay was completed only 10 days before Dr. Jung's death, and so obviously he thought the things he was saying in this essay are incredibly important. And this paragraph I keep coming back to again and again, and the paragraph is, as any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect.